Okay, now we come to a really interesting relationship, the bilateral relationship. Bilateral is going to be symbolized by the letters BL. And in a bilateral relationship, what we have is a bilateral proposition supports two other propositions, one preceding and one following, which is why I have three arcs drawn here for our example, because in a bilateral situation, you're always going to have a central proposition that is supporting two other propositions or two other sets of propositions in both directions at once, one preceding and one following, all under one arc, one bilateral relationship. The key words for the bilateral relationship, you're going to look on your cheat sheet and you're going to see that it points you to the conjunctions for ground and inference, because both of these relationships, it's going to be like a ground and inference sandwich when you run into a bilateral relationship, because both are happening simultaneously. And in the example I'll show you what I mean by that. So sometimes you're going to see words like for or because that point you to a relationship normally of ground. And sometimes you're going to see words like therefore or consequently that usually point you to the relationship of inference. So you're going to see those working because they're both happening at the same time. When we arc this, we're going to label the central proposition or the central set of propositions, BL, for bilateral, and then we're going to draw one arc over the top of all three to show that these three propositions or these three sets of propositions exist in the relationship of bilateral, in the bilateral relationship. The proposition preceding and the proposition following are both supported by this central proposition which supports these other two bilaterally. That's what's happening. So let me give you an example of this to look at here together. Psalm 67, 4 through 5, we can begin to identify the propositions. And even if you don't immediately recognize the relationship, that's not a problem, because you're going to read over the text, then you're going to follow our steps, divide it into its propositions, and then begin to consider the relationships between the propositions. This is why we are arcing these verses, so that we can understand them more. So in Psalm 67, 4 through 5, we have, let the nations be glad, that's the first proposition, and probably a series here, sing for joy. Let the nations be glad and sing for joy. For, another key word, you judge the peoples with equity, and, another proposition, guide the nations upon earth. Selah, we have this untranslatable Hebrew word as part of the Psalms. And then the propositions go on. Let the peoples praise you, O God. The semicolon lets us know that we have a final proposition. Let all the peoples praise you, exclamation point. So let's divide that up into those basic propositions and then label them so that we can begin to understand the relationship between these propositions. Okay, I've written out the verse again, these verses again, according to their propositions, 4a, b, c, d, and 5a and b. And I'm going to draw my line down the left side and one arc over each proposition so that we can begin to consider what is the relationship between each of these propositions. So my eye goes first to this word and, this key word, let the nations be glad and sing for joy. So it seems like we have a relationship of series here. And then we come to the next word, for, which points us usually to the relationship of ground. You judge the peoples with equity and guide the nations upon the earth. So it seems like before we define this relationship of ground, we need to prioritize this another series between C and D that is happening here. You judge the peoples with equity and you guide the nations upon the earth. And if we were only arcing verse 4, we could draw one arc over those 4 propositions and label them as a ground relationship. But we have verse 5 to deal with as well. And it seems like verse 5, A and B, also have a series relationship between those 2 statements. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. 2 propositions that equally contribute. So we have 3 sets of propositions set in series, 4AB, 4CD, and 5AB. And then our eye goes back to this word 4, which usually points us to the relationship of ground, but we also have to ask, what about the relationship that goes in this direction? And we can start to see that just as you judge the peoples of the earth with equity and guide the nations upon earth supports the gladness of the nations and their singing for joy, it also seems to support in this direction as well. If we read it like this, for instance, you judge the peoples with equity and guide the nations upon the earth, and we inserted a word like therefore, or consequently, let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. We can see that that points us to a truth here that seems to be implied, that there's support from CD going in this direction and in this direction at once. So instead of using simply ground or influence, we can see that there's a bilateral support that's happening here as CD becomes the reason for the preceding propositions and the following propositions. And so I'm going to label this as bilateral, and I'm going to draw one arc over all 3 to symbolize that this central proposition is bilaterally supporting these other propositions, one preceding and one following. There's bilateral support going in both directions, and that's how I would arc bilateral. That's one example of arcing the bilateral relationship.